Everyone carries a shadow, not just in some poetic sense, but in a deeply personal psychological reality. And for anyone serious about spiritual growth, understanding this, shadow is not optional. It's essential. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in modern psychology, once said, "The less the shadow is embodied in our conscious life, the blacker and denser it becomes." What does that mean? It means that the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or simply avoid the insecurities, the anger, the envy, the pain, don't just vanish. They retreat into the unconscious, gaining power in silence, and when left unexamined, they don't stay hidden forever. They wait, they gather force, and then they erupt often at the worst possible moments. Sometimes it's a passive-aggressive comment we blurt out without thinking. Other times, it's a subtle bitterness that seeps into how we see others or ourselves. We like to believe we're in control, but the truth is, what we do not face within us controls us from the dark. Jung called this the personal shadow, the part of ourselves we have no desire to be, the traits we hide, the flaws we pretend don't exist, the fears we bury. And while it may feel uncomfortable to look at those parts, the real danger lies in ignoring them. Because what we refuse to see becomes the very thing that shapes our choices, our relationships, our lives. And here's something even more sobering. Most people aren't even aware they're being controlled by their shadow. They think this is just how I am. But in reality, they're stuck in patterns they never chose, patterns that were built by pain, shame, fear, or rejection. But the shadow isn't only darkness. In fact, Jung wrote that the shadow also holds our creative impulses, our instincts, our insights, things that when embraced can liberate us. The shadow is not an enemy. It's more like a neglected friend, misunderstood, yes, but not evil. As Marie-Louise von Franz Jung's close collaborator once said, the shadow only becomes hostile when it is ignored or misunderstood. To make peace with the shadow is to reclaim the pieces of ourselves we've long disowned: our confidence, our voice, our courage to be seen, like someone who once believed that being assertive meant being rude, so they stayed quiet, humble, agreeable. But in doing so, they lost the strength to ask for what they needed, to rise in their career, to claim their own worth. And that's how the shadow quietly steals from us, not by destroying us outright, but by convincing us to live smaller than we were meant to be. When someone who's repressed their assertiveness meets a person who fully embodies it, something stirs deep inside them. Not admiration, but resentment and guilt. It's as if the shadow whispers, "That could have been you, if only you weren't so afraid." And that resentment doesn't just sit there. It grows. It thickens. The shadow makes it denser, darker. Because every time we refuse to integrate a part of ourselves, we don't just lose it. We feed the very thing we fear. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Jung teaches that these missing pieces, the qualities we've pushed into the dark, must be brought back into the light. They must be lived. And for that to happen, our ego, our pride, must take a step down, because humility is the price of inner transformation. One of the most fascinating ways the shadow reveals itself is through our dreams. Often, it shows up as someone of the same sex as the dreamer, a symbolic mirror. And when this figure appears, it feels like a harsh critique of our character, a silent accusation from within. It's uncomfortable, it's confronting, and yet it's profoundly honest. We blush in the dream, we shrink back, but something inside us knows. This is me too. This is where the real work begins. What Jung called the realization of the shadow, what we now know as shadow work. And in the journey of spiritual growth, this work is non-negotiable. It's not glamorous, it's not quick. It's the slow, often painful process of inner reconciliation. Like the ancient labors of Hercules, shadow work demands strength, endurance, and most of all, radical self-honesty. We begin by watching ourselves, our emotional reactions, our relationships, the way we judge others, and asking the hard questions: why did that trigger me? What am I avoiding? What part of myself am I refusing to accept? And then we go inward through dreams, through quiet reflection, through sacred silence. It's not about fighting the darkness. It's about shining a light into it and letting it illuminate us in return. Jung wrote, "There is no light without shadow, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection." That means we're not here to be perfect. We're here to be whole, and wholeness requires us to embrace all of who we are, not just the polished parts. This is the path of individuation, the lifelong unfolding of our true self, the alignment of the ego with the self, the deeper, fuller, wiser self that holds our entire being together. It's not always beautiful, it's not always easy, but it is real. And with that reality comes a kind of sacred relief, the peace that only comes from telling the truth, the full truth, the hard truth, the liberating truth. But let's be honest, most people won't do this work. It's easier to stay asleep, to avoid the hard questions, to pretend our shadows don't exist. Some won't even explore the moral consequences of what they do know, let alone examine what lies buried in the unconscious. And yet if we never look within, we stay enslaved by what we refuse to name. And it's not just personal, because there's another shadow, a greater one that lives not in individuals but in cultures, in communities, in entire societies. Jung called it the collective shadow, the dark, unspoken underbelly of civilization. It's where the norms we deny, the injustices we perpetuate, the fears we collectively avoid all lives. And just like the personal shadow, the collective one grows stronger the more we ignore it. And when a society refuses to face its darkness, it creates division, hatred, dehumanization, war, not because people are inherently evil, but because what is repressed will always return. The collective shadow is not just an abstract psychological concept, it is a living, breathing force woven into the very fabric of human history. It is vast. It is horrifying, and more often than not, it is invisible. We see it in the cruelty that humans inflict upon each other, and the violence we inflict upon the natural world. We feel its weight in the suffering that echoes across generations passed down not just through stories, but through blood, through memory, through the silence of things never spoken. The collective shadow lives in the projection of otherness when we brand a people or culture as inferior, dangerous, or less than. It thrives in systems of violence and oppression, in our failure to see the suffering around us, in our refusal to take responsibility. Yes, sometimes it shows up in obvious catastrophic ways, wars, massacres, genocide, but other times it hides in plain sight, dressed in moral clothing, cloaked in progress. It might look like a noble cause, a missionary effort, a public policy, a cultural mandate, but underneath it can carry the same shadow, the erasure of language, the suppression of identity, the silencing of souls. Like all shadows, the collective one is most dangerous when it is denied. And make no mistake, its fingerprints are everywhere. On a global scale, it reveals itself in cultural collapse, malnutrition, poverty, systemic addiction, generational trauma. But it also manifests inside the individual psyche, as self-hatred, cultural shame inherited, rage, deep depression, and the quiet longing to make others suffer what we have silently endured. In religious traditions, this was once called evil. In Christianity, it was the devil, an entity so consumed by shadow that it stripped people of their humanity. But Jung didn't see evil as something outside of us. He saw it as the part of ourselves we refuse to know. And the antidote? Self-knowledge, wholeness, a radical willingness to see the truth, not just the beauty, but the brokenness within us. As Jung wrote, we must know relentlessly how much good we can do and what crimes we are capable of. Because when we refuse to see what we're capable of, we project that capacity onto others, and history repeats itself. So how do we begin? By taking responsibility, morally, politically, spiritually. The courage to face our shadow doesn't just heal us, it liberates others from having to carry it on our behalf. This is true on a personal level and on a collective one. Because the pain of the past doesn't just disappear, it lingers. It haunts the present until someone's brave enough to stop pretending it never happened. And to be clear, this is not about guilt. It's about responsibility. The sacred human act of saying, "This happened, it matters, and I will not look away." Across the world, people have tried to heal these wounds through public apologies, reparations, memorials, pilgrimages to places of unthinkable pain. These gestures are not perfect, but they are necessary. Because without them, the shadow only grows stronger. The desire to move on is understandable. But healing doesn't happen by forgetting. It happens by remembering together, honestly, tenderly, courageously. Because what we bury buries us, and what we bring into the light begins to set us free. But how do we truly confront the past so that shadow integration isn't just a political gesture or a symbolic apology from those in power, but a real soul-level reckoning within the hearts of everyday people? The answer isn't simple, because the truth is healing hurts. Remembering what was once unspeakable, speaking what was never allowed to be said, is a painful process, not just for the victims, but for the perpetrators, for the bystanders, for the generations born long after the harm was done, but who still carry its echo in their blood. But no healing, no real integration can happen until the pain is voiced, until the grief is heard, until the outrage, the betrayal, the guilt, the denial, the suffering are allowed to breathe. Truth-telling, then, is not just a noble idea. It is a spiritual necessity. It is how we make space for accountability, healing, and authentic spiritual growth. How we stop cycles from repeating. How we begin to remember not just what happened, but who we really are. History gives us haunting examples of what happens when the shadow is left unexamined. Take Nazi Germany. Millions of people, many of whom considered themselves ordinary moral citizens, slipped into a collective trance. They did things they never believed they were capable of. They obeyed orders, spread lies, turned away from their neighbors. What began as personal denial became collective madness. The personal shadow left unchecked became a bridge to the collective shadow. And through that bridge, the demonic entered. Jung warned us, if we do not resolve our inner conflicts, we become vulnerable to the collective ones. That is why shadow work always begins at home. With the self, heal the personal shadow, and you will not be so easily swept into someone else's darkness. This inner work, painful though it is, becomes our protection. And more than that, it becomes our contribution. Because when one person finds clarity, they become a light for others. When one soul refuses to look away, they give others permission to look too. As Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, if we practice mindfulness, we will know how to look deeply into the nature of war. and with our insight wake people up, so that together we can avoid repeating the same horrors again and again. The war is in us, but it is also in everyone. Everything is ready to explode, and we are all co-responsible. This is what shadow work ultimately demands of us: to be radically honest with ourselves, to notice what triggers us, to ask what we're avoiding, to trace our emotional reactions back to the wound, the fear, the lie, to listen to our dreams, to confront our projections, to wrestle sometimes for years with the dark, so that slowly we rescue the gold buried underneath, the gifts, the strengths, the radiant truths we lost when we chose to hide. And once we've done this for ourselves, we begin to see the shadow in the world more clearly. We stop being passive victims of history. We stop playing along with denial, and we find the courage to face what our culture, our community, or even our faith tradition may have refused to name. Because ignoring the shadow doesn't make it disappear, it makes it grow darker, heavier, more dangerous, until one day it erupts, and history once again repeats itself. But if this video stirred something in you, don't just watch. Take a step. Share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment. Subscribe. This message was made for souls like you, ready to awaken and step deeper into spiritual growth. Until next time, stay awake, stay whole, and walk gently with the shadow.